A silent rider buys a mother and child, unaware that she would heal his heart. I ain't saying nothin'. Just don't send me back. The words were a ghost of a sound, swallowed by the biting wind that tore across the barren main street of redemption. Jedediah Thorne heard them, though. He heard them under the auctioneer's grating call and the low, mocking laughter of the assembled men. He stood apart, a figure carved from the gray landscape, his shoulders weary under a dusty coat. His eyes, the color of a slate evening sky, had seen everything and wanted to see nothing more. He'd come to town for salt and flour, not for the sorrow of a woman with exhaustion etched into the fine lines of her face and a small boy clinging to her worn skirt. Her name was Alara. The auctioneer had barked, her indenture for sale to cover her husband's gambling debts. She stood on the crude platform, a china doll left out in the rain, silent but not shattered. Jedediah saw the rigid set of her jaw, the way her hand rested protectively on her son's head. It was a dignity that had no place in this dusty, merciless theater. A memory flickered in the numb recesses of his mind. Another woman, another child, another fever that stole the warmth from his world and left only silence. He saw the grave on the hill behind his homestead, a small mound of rocks he could never quite look at directly. The auctioneer's voice droned on. Sold, for the price of her passage and keep, to Mr. Blackwood, for service at the saloon. A wave of nausea, cold and bitter, rolled through Jedediah. Blackwood was a man whose wealth was built on the misery of others, his smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. Jedediah watched Alara flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her frame. He saw the boy, no older than his own would have been, bury his face deeper into her legs. Something broke inside him, a dam of indifference that had held for 5 long years. He took a step forward, then another. The creak of his worn leather boots on the boardwalk was the only sound he made. He moved against his own nature, against the solitude he had cultivated like a bitter crop. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. I'll double it. The crowd turned. Blackwood's smile vanished. The auctioneer stammered, his eyes wide. Jedediah didn't look at them. His gaze was fixed on the woman. He pulled a heavy leather pouch from his belt, the metal clinking softly, and tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a solid, earthy thud. It was more than enough. It was everything he had. He didn't know it yet, but his first true home was right in front of him. The transaction was a blur of hostile glares and hastily signed papers. Blackwood's eyes promised a future reckoning. Jedediah ignored it. He simply nodded toward his wagon. Get in. Alara looked at him, her eyes a deep well of suspicion and raw fear. He saw the question there. Was this a rescue, or just a different cage? He offered no comfort, no explanation. He just turned and walked away, expecting her to follow. She did. The journey to his homestead was carved from silence. The wagon wheels groaned in the dusty ruts. The wind howled its lonely song through the canyons, and the space between the three of them felt as vast and empty as the plains stretching to the horizon. Jedediah kept his eyes on the mules, his jaw set. He could feel her gaze on his back, questioning, probing. He offered nothing in return. He had acted on an impulse he didn't understand, a ghost's whisper from a life he'd tried to bury. Now the consequence sat behind him, a living, breathing woman and a child who hadn't made a sound since leaving town. The homestead was not a welcoming place. It was a testament to survival, not comfort. A small, solid cabin stood against the looming shadow of the mountain, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney into the pale winter sun. A barn leaned nearby, its wood weathered to the color of bone. There was a corral, a well, and the endless, crushing silence of the wilderness. He stopped the wagon and got down without a word. He unhitched the mules, his movements deliberate and economical. Alara remained seated, clutching her son, Liam, as if waiting for a command. The boy's tired eyes, wide and dark, took in the desolation. Finally, Jedediah gestured with his chin toward the cabin. You and the boy take the cabin. He picked up his bedroll from the wagon. I'll be in the barn. She slid down from the wagon, her landing unsteady. She stood there, a fragile shape in the vastness, her shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. She nodded once, a sharp, bird-like motion. It was an acceptance of terms, not an agreement. The wooden door to the cabin creaked open, revealing a sparse room. There was a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, one chair, and a bed built into the wall. A few tin cups and plates sat on a shelf. It was a room for one person, one ghost. He watched her enter, her back ramrod straight. The door closed, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Their life fell into a rhythm defined by work and quiet. He would rise before the sun. The sound of his axe splitting would a sharp crack in the frosty air. He would leave a stack by her door, along with a bucket of fresh water from the well. He never saw her take it. He would work his land, mending fences, tending to the mules, his physical exhaustion a welcome anesthetic for his mind. She, in turn, established her own unobtrusive routine. The smell of baking bread would sometimes drift from the cabin, a scent so deeply tied to his past it felt like a physical blow. She washed their clothes in a tub by the well, her hands red and raw from the cold water, and hung them on a line he had strung between two pines. They moved around each other like two planets in a silent, predictable orbit, held apart by a gravity of pain and mistrust. She was a reliable presence, as quiet and enduring as the mountains themselves, but her fear was a wall between them. He was a provider, grim and distant. He had saved her from one fate, only to deliver her to this profound isolation. Days bled into weeks, each one a copy of the last, etched in frost and silence. Jedediah chopped wood deep into the night, as if splitting his guilt into pieces. He couldn't name the feeling that had made him by her, but its weight settled on his weary shoulders. He found himself watching her, not with desire, but with a kind of pained curiosity. He saw the way she would sit with Liam on the cabin steps, pointing out a hawk circling in the slate evening sky, her voice a low murmur he couldn't quite hear. He saw the threadbare nature of the boy's shoes, the soles worn down to almost nothing. One evening, after they had retired to the cabin, he took the small, battered shoes from the spot where she left them to dry by the door. In the smoky lamplight of the barn, he worked the leather with his calloused, deliberate hands, softening it with grease, stitching a new, thick piece of hide to the bottom. His stitches were crude, but strong. Before the first hint of dawn, he placed the mended shoes back on the doorstep and was gone before the light touched the valley floor. He never acknowledged the act, and she never mentioned it. But when he saw the boy running near the creek later that week, his steps more solid, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. It was a feeling he had long since forgotten, and its return was unsettling. He began to leave other things. A brace of rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot, left hanging from a hook by the door. A jar of wild berry preserves he'd made last fall, placed silently on the porch railing. A thick wool blanket, one he'd had for years, folded neatly on the bench beside the cabin entrance one particularly bitter night when the wind howled like a hungry wolf. These were not gifts. They were provisions, offerings made to the silence, attempts to communicate in the only language he had left. He was secretly, cautiously trying to mend more than just a pair of shoes. Alara received these gestures with a growing sense of confusion. The man in the barn was a puzzle. His face was a mask of indifference, his presence intimidating and remote. Yet, these unobtrusive acts of kindness contradicted the harsh exterior. She'd spent her life navigating the whims of cruel or careless men. This quiet, reliable provision was something entirely new. She began to watch him, too. From the small window in the cabin, she saw him work from dawn until dusk, his movements tireless. She saw the way he would sometimes stop and stare at the small, rock-covered mound on the hill, his entire body going still. A profound sadness seemed to emanate from him then, a loneliness so deep it made her own heart ache in sympathy. The fear she had carried with her from redemption began to slowly recede, replaced by a fragile hope. He had not hurt her. He had not made demands. He had given her shelter, food, and a strange, solitary peace. Her rigid posture began to soften. A concealed tension in her shoulders eased. The world was still a dangerous place, but perhaps this one small corner of it, ruled by a silent, wounded man, was safe. It was a terrifying thought. Hope was a more dangerous thing than despair. The sky had been a bruised purple for 2 days, the air thick with the promise of violence. Then the blizzard came. It descended from the mountain without warning, a roaring white wall of wind and snow that erased the world. The biting wind shrieked, rattling the cabin's single window and forcing snow through the cracks in the wooden door. Jedediah had just managed to get the mules into the barn when the storm hit its full fury. He looked toward the cabin, a faint orange glow from the smoky lamp barely visible through the swirling vortex. For the first time, the 100 yards between the barn and the house felt like a deadly, uncrossable chasm. He endured the first night in the barn, the cold seeping into his bones, the sounds of the storm a monstrous symphony. But by the second day, a new sound joined the howling wind, a faint, persistent coughing from the cabin. It was a small, weak sound, but it cut through the storm's rage with the sharpness of a knife. He waited, telling himself it was nothing. But the coughing grew more frequent, more ragged. It was the boy. He knew that sound. He had heard it once before, in a long, desperate week that had ended at the grave on the hill. The memory propelled him into action. He wrapped his face in a scarf, pulled his hat down low, and plunged into the white chaos. The wind stung his skin, stealing his breath. He fought for every step, his world reduced to the churning snow in front of him. When he finally reached the cabin door, he was covered in ice, his lungs burning. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open, and a blast of wind and snow followed him in. Alara was crouched by the hearth, her face pale and etched with fear. Liam was wrapped in every blanket they owned, his small body trembling, his face flushed with a feverish heat. He was struggling for each breath. She froze when she saw Jedediah, her fear of him momentarily warring with her fear for her son. He didn't speak. He strode to the hearth, his presence filling the small room. He touched the boy's forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. The heat was alarming. "Fever," he said, his voice a low rasp. He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct for the first time. "He needs willow bark tea." To break it, she just stared, her throat too tight to speak. She didn't know what that was or where to get it. He seemed to understand. He went to a small chest in the corner, one she had never touched, and pulled out a dried bundle of herbs and bark. His movements were swift, sure. He knew what he was doing. He set a tin pot of water over the fire, his back to her. The forced proximity in the small cabin was a heavy, tangible thing. The storm raged outside, trapping them, while another storm, one of sickness and memory, raged within. She watched him, this broad-shouldered stranger, as he prepared the medicine. He was no longer just the man in the barn. He was her only hope. She had to trust him. "More water," he grunted, and she obeyed without hesitation, her previous fear forgotten, replaced by a desperate alliance. For 2 days and nights they fought the fever together. The blizzard continued its assault, sealing them inside the small, warm bubble of the cabin, the world outside ceasing to exist. Jedediah moved with a quiet, calm efficiency that belied the storm in his own heart. Each cough from the boy was a fresh stab of memory, each labored breath a ghost of the past. He forced the bitter willow bark tea between Liam's dry lips, a spoonful at a time. He bathed the boy's forehead with snowmelt, his large, rough hands surprisingly tender. Alara was his shadow, her initial fear replaced by a focused, maternal desperation. She held Liam's small hand, murmuring soft words of comfort. She kept the fire fed, the kettle full. They spoke only when necessary. "The fire's low. He needs to drink. Hold him up." Yet, in the shared space of their vigil, a new language formed between them. It was in the way he would look at her, a quick, questioning glance to see if she needed to rest. It was in the way she would place a tin cup of hot water beside him without being asked. They were no longer two separate, orbiting bodies, but a team, bound by a single urgent purpose. She saw past the stoic cowboy to the man beneath. She saw the raw, suppressed pain in his eyes when the boy's fever spiked, and she understood that his gruffness was a shield, not a weapon. He saw past the resilient survivor to the exhausted woman. He saw the trembling in her hands as she held the cup to her son's lips, the deep, dark circles under her eyes. He saw her strength, and it was a quiet, dignified thing that humbled him. On the third morning, the wind finally died down. A pale, watery sun filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. And in the sudden, profound silence, they heard it. The sound of a child steady, even breathing. The fever had broken. Liam was sleeping peacefully, his skin cool to the touch. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over the room. Alara sank onto the single chair, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion, and wept. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent, streaming tears of gratitude and release. Jedediah stood by the hearth, watching her. He didn't know what to do with a woman's tears. He felt an overwhelming urge to offer comfort, an impulse he hadn't felt in years. He took a hesitant step toward her, then stopped. Instead, he simply ladled some broth from a pot on the fire into a bowl and placed it on the table in front of her. "Eat," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes red but clear. She nodded, and for the first time, a small, unsteady smile touched her lips. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. Something had irrevocably shifted. The ice had cracked. When the snows finally melted enough for the path to be passable, the need for supplies became urgent. The flour was gone, the salt nearly so. The journey to redemption was no longer a choice. Jedediah loaded the wagon, and this time he didn't tell Alara to get in. He simply waited, and she came with Liam, her face calm, and took her place on the wagon seat beside him. The silence on this ride was different. It wasn't born of mistrust, but of a shared experience. It was comfortable, companionable. The town, however, had not changed. As they pulled up to the general store, he saw eyes on them, curious, judging. Whispers followed them like dust devils. He tried to ignore them, focusing on his list. While he was trading his furs for goods, Alara took Liam to look at the sweets in a jar on the counter. That's when Mr. Blackwood entered, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. His eyes landed on Alara, and a cruel, possessive smirk spread across his face. "Well, look what the mountain man dragged back to town," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Alara froze, her hand tightening on Liam's shoulder. She lowered her gaze, her body becoming rigid once more. "Tired of your silent provider, my dear?" Blackwood continued, taking a step closer. "I'm sure the company at the saloon is much more entertaining. You are still my property in a manner of speaking. He only bought your labor, not your dignity." Not that you had much to begin with. The scattered patrons of the store fell silent, watching the humiliation unfold. Alara's face was ashen. She tried to pull Liam behind her, to shield him from the venom in the man's words. She looked broken, just as she had on the auction block. Jedediah felt a white-hot rage rise within him, a protective instinct so fierce it took his breath away. He turned from the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, and stepped directly between Blackwood and Alara. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a solid, immovable wall. His silence was more menacing than any threat. "Get out of my way, Thorn," Blackwood sneered, trying to regain his footing. "This is between me and my property." Jedediah's voice, when it came, was dangerously low, a growl that promised violence. "She's with me." He reached into his coat and pulled out the small, heavy pouch of gold dust he always carried for emergencies. He threw it on the counter with a heavy thud that made the jars rattle. It was a small fortune. "That covers any debt, real or imagined, you think you're owed," he said, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's. He then looked at Alara, his expression softening for a fraction of a second, and then back to the stunned crowd. His next words rang with the clarity of a bell in the silent room. "Not bought." Chosen. Blackwood stared, speechless. The crowd shifted, their mockery turning to a grudging respect. Alara let out a choked sob, the sound of a cage door swinging open. Jedediah did not move. He just stood there, protecting his family. He stayed. The ride back to the homestead was as quiet as the first, but the quality of the silence had transformed completely. It was no longer a chasm of distrust but a shared space of profound, unspoken understanding. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her in front of the world, severing the last tie to her past with the finality of an axe blow. She kept glancing at him, at his weathered profile silhouetted against the setting sun, her heart full of a feeling she couldn't yet name. It was more than gratitude. It was a growing, gentle tenderness. That evening, the air was cool and clean after the long winter. They sat on the small porch he had built, a space they had never shared before. The wind whispered through the dry grass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, her voice, soft and a little unsteady, broke the stillness. "My husband," she began, not looking at him. "He wasn't a bad man, just weak. He chased a dream of gold and lost everything we had. When he died of a fever on the trail, his debts fell to me." To Liam, she finally turned to look at him, her eyes dark pools in the dusk. "You didn't buy an indentured servant, Jedediah. You bought a widow with nothing left to her name but her son." He listened, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He nodded slowly, absorbing her story, her truth. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, honest thing. Then it was his turn. He swallowed hard, the words feeling foreign in his throat after years of being locked away. "There's a grave on the hill," he said, his voice raw. "My wife, Sarah, and our little girl, Molly." He paused, the pain of the name still sharp. "Same fever that took your husband. The one Liam just fought. Couldn't save them. I came up here to forget, to let the silence take me." Too, he fell silent, the weight of his own confession settling around him. He had shared the source of his pain, the reason for his solitude. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Then he felt a soft, warm touch on his arm. Her hand rested there, a small point of contact in the vast loneliness. It wasn't a gesture of pity, but of shared understanding. They were two survivors, each with their own ghosts, no longer alone. Later, inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken emotion. She was by the stove, and he was mending a harness strap nearby. He was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her, to see the soft strands of hair that had escaped her bun. He caught her scent, not of perfume or powder, but something clean and real, of soap, wood smoke, and woman. It was a scent he thought he had buried forever with Sarah. It filled his senses, awakening a part of him that had long been numb. He stopped his work. He moved closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He leaned in, his lips close to her ear, and his voice was a broken, wondering whisper. "I forgot what woman smelled like." He saw her shiver, her eyes closing for a moment. He gently turned her to face him. He looked into her tired eyes, and for the first time, he saw not just a survivor, but a beautiful, resilient woman. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a tender, hesitant kiss, full of all the grief, gratitude, and growing hope that had passed between them in silence. It was the kiss of a man coming home. Spring arrived at the homestead like a quiet miracle. The biting wind gentled into a soft breeze, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Patches of determined green pushed through the last of the melting snow. The transformation of the land was mirrored by the transformation within the small cabin. It was no longer a place of solitude and survival, but a place of life. Laughter, a sound long absent, now echoed in the small valley. It was Liam's laughter, bright and clear as he chased butterflies, and sometimes, a softer, warmer laugh from Alara as she watched him. Jedediah found himself smiling, a slow, unfamiliar stretching of muscles he thought had forgotten how. The rhythm of their days was still built on work, but now they worked together. He taught Liam how to carve small animals from scraps of wood, his large, calloused hands guiding the boy's small ones with surprising patience. He would watch the boy's face, tight with concentration, and see a ghost of the future he thought he'd lost. Alara planted a garden in the rich soil near the cabin. She coaxed rows of beans, squash, and corn from the earth with a tender, hopeful diligence. Jedediah tilled the hard ground for her, turning the earth with his shovel, preparing the way. They moved around each other with an easy, unspoken grace, a team that understood each other without the need for many words. Her presence was a quiet, steadying warmth in his life. His was a solid, reliable strength in hers. The cabin itself began to change. Curtains, sewn from an old flour sack, appeared in the window. A jar of wildflowers sat on the rough-hewn table. These small, unobtrusive touches were her way of claiming the space, of turning a shelter into a home. He had moved his things in from the barn without discussion. It was a natural progression, an unspoken acceptance that their lives were now intertwined. One evening, as she mended a tear in Liam's shirt by the firelight, he looked at her, truly looked at her. Her hair caught the orange glow of the flames, and her face, no longer etched with fear, was calm and beautiful. He realized the deep ache of loneliness that had been his constant companion for 5 years was gone. It hadn't been vanquished in a dramatic battle, but had simply faded away, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of their shared life. He had bought a woman and child out of a flicker of guilty memory, but they, in turn, had bought him back from the dead. He had found a family where he had only sought solitude. The homestead thrived. Winter had passed. They were home. Love grows where no one looks. It doesn't need grand declarations or sunlit avenues. Sometimes, it takes root in the hardest ground, in the silent spaces between two wounded people who have forgotten what it feels like to hope. It had grown here, on this remote homestead, nurtured by shared hardship and quiet acts of kindness. It was in the mended shoes left on a doorstep, in the cup of willow bark tea offered in the dead of night. It was in the protective wall of a man's body in a crowded general store and the gentle touch of a woman's hand on a grieving man's arm. Jedediah and Alara had not sought love. They had sought survival, a refuge from a cruel world. But in providing that refuge for each other, they had built something far more profound. They had built a family. Their story was not one of passionate romance, but of a slow, deliberate healing. Every shared meal, every cord of wood chopped, every row of seeds planted was a stitch, mending the torn fabric of their lives. They had learned to read each other's silences, to understand the language of gestures. A nod from him meant, "I am here," a soft smile from her meant, "I am safe," in the evenings. After Liam was asleep, Jedediah began a new project. He selected a piece of sturdy, beautiful pine he had been saving for years. With his sharpest knife and a deep, focused patience, he began to carve. Shavings fell to the floor as he worked by the firelight, the scraping of the blade a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet cabin. He was not just shaping wood. He was shaping a future. He was carving a rocker. It was a thing of permanence, of comfort. It was for her. It was a promise, unspoken but solid as the wood in his hands, that this was her place to rest, to be safe, to watch her son grow. It was a symbol that his silent, solitary world now had a warm, beating heart at its center. He didn't know it, but he was building a throne for the quiet queen who had conquered his desolate kingdom. The rocker was finished on a warm afternoon when the scent of honeysuckle drifted in from the hills. He had sanded the wood until it was smooth as river stone, rubbing it with beeswax until it held a soft, deep glow. It was a simple, honest piece of furniture, but it was made with all the unspoken feeling in his heart. He carried it into the cabin and placed it by the hearth, near the window that looked out over her garden. It looked as though it had always been there. He didn't make a grand speech. He didn't need to. He simply opened the window, letting in the warm spring air and the sound of a distant meadowlark. The gesture was its own statement. The house was no longer a sealed fortress against the world, but an open, breathing home. Alara came in from the garden, her hands earthy, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She stopped when she saw the rocker, her eyes tracing its clean, strong lines. She looked from the chair to him, and her eyes filled with a deep, knowing tenderness. He stood by the open door, his hands in his pockets, feeling clumsy and exposed. All he had to offer her was this place, this life himself. He cleared his throat. "Stay here," he said. The words were quiet, a little rough. It was not a command. It was not even a question. It was a plea, a hope, an offering of everything he was. She walked over to him, her gaze never leaving his. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't speak. She just nodded. She stayed. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts, a family. Theirs was a love story written not in words, but in shared labor, mutual respect, and the quiet dignity of survival. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness, two broken souls found in each other not a cure for their old wounds, but a way to live with them, together. The silent rider and the resilient survivor built more than a homestead. They built a sanctuary, proving that the most profound connections are often forged in the quietest moments. If the story touched you, like warm light in a cold night, then carry it with you. Remember that strength is not about the absence of fear, but about taking the next step anyway. Remember that kindness, even a small, secret gesture, can be the seed from which a new life grows. And remember that everyone, no matter how lost they seem, is searching for a place to finally feel safe, to be chosen. Subscribe to our channel for more stories full of silence, courage, and genuine closeness. And tell us what moved you the most. Was it the moment he stood before her in the store, the quiet confession on the porch, or the final, simple plea for her to stay? We'll see you again, where silence means home.